Well, good morning to everyone in the chapel. Our chapel service is a part of this morning, so it's great to have all of you that are in the chapel service. And it's great to have all of you here in the Northwest Center, in our worship center. You having a good morning so far? Yeah, it's March. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I don't know why we're clapping, but it's because we're all doing good. Yeah. Well, we are wrapping up our series, Intentional Detours. And where we want to go this morning is to see how sometimes Jesus leads us on intentional detours. And sometimes those intentional detours take us into what I'm going to refer to this morning as deep water. And deep water is nothing more than those moments, and we've all had this happen in our spiritual journeys, moments where it's a situation that God kind of leads us into that becomes difficult, or that there's that sense of risk, or maybe it's just we don't know what God's up to, and we're just like, God, why are you leading me into this situation? What are you up to? And oftentimes when God leads us into these detours intentionally and into deep water, it's because he's doing something in our lives and then through us that we can't always see right away. I had one of these moments more than a decade ago. It struck me as I was prepping for this sermon that more than a decade ago, there was a moment that started out where I just wanted to get my hair cut, and the normal place that I went to get my hair cut was busy or full, so I went into a different place to get my hair cut, and that's all I went in there for, was to get my hair cut. But God kind of turned it into this detour, into deep water. I go in, there's 3 employees that are cutting hair, and I'm sitting in the seat getting my hair cut, and the employees are talking to one another, and they get onto the subject of church, which kind of perked up my ears a little bit. But very quickly, the discussion about church turned to how awful churches were. And it's just all about manipulation. And those lousy pastors and priests, they're just a bunch of hypocrites. They try and beat people up and use guilt and condemnation to build themselves up by beating other people down. And I'm just like, whoa. What a colossal waste of my time. I can't wait to just get my hair cut and get out of here. And then the woman who was cutting my hair, kind of looks into the mirror and says, "So, honey, what do you do?" Yeah. This happens to me. I don't know why. It happens to me on airplanes. It happens all. So here's what I do. And I've done this a dozen times. It's never worked. I don't know why I keep doing it. I go, well, I'm a speaker. See how sly that was? I'm not lying, but I'm like avoiding right here. I'm a speaker. Oh, clip. And I'm noticing the sharp scissors very close to my head. And you can just see kind of a puzzled look on her face. So what do you talk about? Like life and the universe and, just clip, sharp scissors, Where do you speak? In front of people. That's where I speak. So, it's just that, can I, and the whole time I'm just thinking, I really don't want to go here. I've heard your conversation. You don't want to do this. I don't want to do this, but sometimes God does want to do this because God's got a plan and God is working on things behind the scenes. And sometimes God puts us on that detour and it takes us into deep water, and we may not know why, but moments like that are when God is working at his best. And there's a great story. It's found in the Gospel of Luke. We've been walking really through the beginning of Christ's ministry out of the Gospel of Luke through this series. And so I'm going to pick up where Seth left off last week, and I'm going to pick up in Luke 5. So if you want to turn to Luke 5, we're going to pick up this story because we're going to look at a moment when Jesus sends Peter on this kind of intentional detour that has Peter a little confused at first, doesn't make much sense. And here's the setting. Jesus has been teaching. He's actually sitting in a little boat on the shores of Galilee, teaching a crowd of people that are sitting on the shore itself. And so he wraps up his teaching, and it's really interesting in this story. Luke only records 2 statements made by Jesus here. But these are very intentional statements. Each statement has two parts. The first statement, as we're going to see in a moment, really speaks to the physical part of what's going on in this story. But then later in the story, Jesus comes back, and the second statement is a parallel statement to the first, two parts as well. And this parallel statement now begins to reveal something of a spiritual nature of what's really happening at a physical level. And the same thing happens with us. Oftentimes, God leads us in some sort of spiritual detour in life, and we are navigating the physical side of the events of what's going through. Something as simple as just getting our hair cut, running into someone else, facing something that's troubling or difficult in life. But there's almost always a spiritual component below the surface where God is doing something more than just the physical part of what we're going through. And when you can begin to see that, then you can begin to see what God is doing behind the scenes in you and through you. And oftentimes that's what occurs in these spiritual detours that God sends us on. He's doing something in us and through us. So we pick up the story here, Luke chapter 5. Jesus finishes his teaching, and Simon, who we know best as Peter, is there. And look at verse 4. It says this, when speaking of Jesus, when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch." And so here's his first statement, two parts, and it's really simple. Here's the first part. Go out into deep water, Peter, okay? Go out into the deep. And the second part is, I want you to fish. I want you to put your nets down for a catch. I want you to go fishing. And that's all it is. And it's this kind of detour. And you can see Peter, in fact, the story tells us that they had been fishing all night. They were done. The guys are on the beach. They're cleaning and repairing their nets. They're probably tired. They want to get their work done so they can go take a nap. And now Jesus says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go out into deep water and put down your nets, okay? There's the detour. And, you know, Peter realizes there's kind of a physical detour here. He realizes Jesus is asking him to do something, and it doesn't make sense because you wouldn't go fishing in the middle of the day like this, and you wouldn't fish in deep water. In fact, look at verse 5, how Peter responds. Simon answered, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. But because you say so, we will let down the nets." You know, and you can just see Peter, and he's talking with the other guys, and they're like, you know, he's a rabbi, not a fisherman. You know, he doesn't understand how this works. You fish at night and you put your nets down in shallow water where the nets go all the way down to the bottom of the lake, because like if you drop your nets out in the deep water, the fish just like swim under the net and then you don't catch any fish, you know? And you can just see Peter trying to explain this maybe to Jesus. You know, we really got to put in shallow water and at nights when they're more active. And, you know, why don't you stick to the rabbi stuff, Jesus? Because you seem a lot better at that. But Peter understands that this is Jesus, and he's asking him to do this. And so even though he doesn't understand, I love Peter in this moment. He's just like, okay, I'll go along with this. And how many times have you been in that spot where you've felt God nudge you in some way? Maybe it was a conversation. Maybe it was something about how you were going to spend your time or your resources. And at first you're just like, you know, I don't know, God, that doesn't make much sense. But there's a part of you that just says, you know, I'll try it. I think maybe this is God nudging me in this direction. And, you know, the truth is I don't have a ton to lose, even though I don't understand this. And simply put, in a way, God's kind of taking you out into deep water. And he wants to do something in you and through you in this moment. So they put down their nets here in the story. You know, it was interesting when I'm talking with this woman, I'm sitting in the chair, and eventually I told her, I said, you know, I'm a pastor. You know, and the whole place just kind of went quiet. Ooh, you know. And at that moment, it was kind of like this thing, you know, I tried to avoid it, and it's just like in my spirit, I just felt like God was saying, yeah, I wasn't going to let you avoid this, you know. And I just realized, you know what, maybe I'm supposed to be here and have this discussion. And so here's and I didn't know what to do at that moment. So I you know, and she's looking at me in the mirror trying, you know, like, oh gosh, and, you know, sharp scissors. And I'm thinking, so I just asked her this question. I said, you know, sounds like you had a really bad experience somewhere. Tell me about it. And it kind of opened up this new conversation where she just kind of explained to me what her experience was and why she had those feelings. And some of the other employees kind of piped in, and we continued this discussion about how bad churches are and pastors. And, remember, I am a pastor. But I gained some good insight and just kind of carried on this conversation, not knowing where it would go in these moments. And so here's Peter. He kind of goes along with this and picks up the story here. And so they load up the nets, they push out. Look down at verse 6 here. So they actually go out, they're going to drop the nets, and you can tell the other guys are like, are we really going to do this? Mm-hmm. Okay. But look what happens. Verse 6. When they had done so, they caught such a great number of fish that their nets began to break. And maybe you've heard this story, maybe you haven't, but it becomes this remarkable miracle where they catch so many fish that they can't even, in fact, the nets start to break. They call in some other fishermen that they work with. They have to bring out another boat, and together these two boats struggle to bring in this whole load. This may have been like a week's worth of fish, at least like an entire night or a couple nights worth of work of fish. And you can this would be this wonderful moment. They're caught up in the excitement of all that's happening, and they begin pulling in the fish. And at some point, they struggle and fight and pull all of these fish into the shore. And just imagine these fishermen as they're just staring at this massive load of fish that they've just brought in. But this begins to be the moment where this really begins to dawn on Peter what's really been going on. See, for him, all of a sudden, he begins to see Jesus in a whole new light in this adventure. In fact, look down at verse 8, at what happens here. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man." And he was a sinful man. And there's this moment where somehow seeing God with greater depth and clarity caused him to see himself in a whole new way. And sometimes that happens. Sometimes we have these moments where we experience God in a vast new way. Maybe it's a moment of worship. You're here worshiping, and in some way you begin to experience God in some new way. Or maybe God has worked some sort of miraculous thing in your life, whether it was financial or with your health or some desperate situation, and God began to work in your life. And in this moment that you begin to see God in his awesomeness or in his majesty or in his work, and you're kind of blown away by it, sometimes it causes us to see ourselves with greater clarity. Sometimes we see our humanity with greater clarity. Sometimes we begin to see our sin, as it was here with Peter, with greater clarity. And sometimes it can actually be a marvelous moment with God in these moments as we see not just God, but ourselves with greater clarity. And one of the things that I love about Jesus, you even see it here in this moment, is that it's never God's intent to simply leave us at that moment. Jesus at this moment could have said, yeah, Peter, you're a sinful dude. It's about time you got it. I want you to just kind of wallow in some guilt here for a little while. I want you to just really just let the condemnation weight you down and plow you under right now. It's never Christ's intent. You look all through the New Testament. You look through the Gospels, and moment after moment, story after story, we see people that are far from God, and they have these encounters with Jesus. And not always, but sometimes in these encounters with Jesus, they begin to see their fallenness in a whole new light. And the beauty of what you see with Jesus in all of those moments is it is never his intent to use those moments to plow them under, to beat them down with their sinfulness. Instead, we see Jesus saying statements like this: I desire mercy, not sacrifice. I didn't come into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world. He has moments where he says, Believe in me and you'll find life. He has this way of taking these moments where we see clarity of our own humanness and uses it to pull us closer to him in these relational moments. So that's one of those reasons where, as I begin to study more and more through the New Testament, through the Gospels, you can't help but fall in love with Jesus Christ. The depth, the passion, the insight, the majesty of him. That we can be full of sin and yet perfectly secure in Christ because of his work on the cross, because of his grace for us. Because his intent is always to do wonderful things in us and through us. And that's what he wants to do here with Peter. He wants to do something wonderful in Peter and through Peter in this moment. And so here's what Jesus says in this moment. It's the second statement. Look with me halfway through verse 10. He says this. Then Jesus said to Simon, don't be afraid. There's the first part. From now on, you will catch men. There's the second part. And what I want you to catch here is Luke does something very precise here. He's paralleling this statement with the first statement. In the first statement, remember Jesus says to Simon, I want you to go into deep water and I want you to catch fish. But see, what's going on at the physical level is never the end of God's story in your life or my life. There's something that God is wanting to do at a spiritual level with all of the physical activities of our life. God has a purpose of doing something in you and through you in this world. And so he says to Peter, I know there are going to be moments where I drag you into deep water. Moments that you're not going to understand it. I'm going to ask you to do something like fish in the middle of the day in deep water, and you're not going to understand it, but I want you to trust me. Don't be afraid. There are going to be moments where you're going to have to navigate waters with your health or with finances that are going to be scary or difficult, but don't be afraid, because I'm going to be at work in you and through you to do something. And just as in a physical way, Peter or Simon, I want you to go catch fish. Part of the work that I'm going to do through you is now to fish for men. You are a part of my kingdom. And friends, this is just the most gorgeous news for every follower of Christ. We're not in this world to just hang out until we die and go to heaven. You have a reason. You have a spiritual purpose in this world. Whatever it is that you do. And you know, some of you here today, I would imagine you're executives. You work in an office maybe. Maybe some of you work in sales. Maybe some of you work in manufacturing. Maybe some of you are teachers. Maybe some of you work out of your house. Maybe some of you, you work in the medical profession. Some of you, maybe in construction. Whatever it is, it doesn't matter. I know this. Underneath that physical role that you play in this world, there is a spiritual role. And God will use the physical things of your life, your routines, your work, what you're doing in a spiritual way. He wants you to fish for men. That's part of what it is to be a follower of Christ. And friends, there will be moments that he'll ask you to go into deep water because he wants you to fish for men and women in this world that matter to him. And he's going to use you in amazing ways to spread his kingdom. So I had my conversation with this woman at the hair cutting place. I don't think you'd call it a barber shop. I don't think she'd call it a bar, whatever it was, the hair salon, whatever it was. And we had this long conversation as she cut my hair about spiritual things, and I didn't think anything of it. Several weeks went by, and I got a call from George Van de Veer. And some of you may know George. He was passed away not too long ago, but he was the director at Evergreen mortuary. And from time to time, he'd give me a call that there'd be someone that had died and there was no pastor involved. And so he'd call me up or someone, and I'd go down there and perform a funeral. And there was a high school student who had died here in Tucson, was actually murdered trying to defend one of his friends. And it was a horrible, horrible incident as this high schooler was murdered. Made the news, and George called me and said, the family, they don't know any pastors or anything. Would you come down here and do this? And so I went down there, got there about an hour early to talk with the family. And I walked back into the little room where the family was. I was told there was a single mom, an older brother, and a younger sister. I walked into that room, and there was the woman who'd cut my hair just 2 weeks earlier. And I realized, God, you were at work. And I didn't know what you were doing, but you did. And when she watched me walk through the door, she burst into tears and gave me this hug. And somehow God put something together so that I could be a pastor that could speak to her in that moment, because I was a pastor that simply listened to her hurts about church and pastors for a long while a couple weeks earlier. And in those moments of her greatest pain in this world, I got to share the gospel with her. And I got to walk through the gospel with her and her older son and her daughter. And there are just moments where God is up to something in us and through us. And I got to tell you, it was a humbling moment for me. And sometimes when God reveals himself, it is a humbling moment for us. But we begin to see that God wants to use us in this world in amazing ways. And, I want to pose this question for you. Because in a sense, God has asked us to fish, right? We've all been asked to fish. And so the question is this: when Jesus was in this world, how did he fish for men? Have you ever asked yourself that question? Because he makes a great model for us. Well, there are three primary things throughout the Gospels we see that Jesus did to fish for human beings. The first one is this: he was simply with people. He spent time with them. In fact, the religious leaders, one of their great criticisms of Jesus was, you eat with sinners. You hang out with them. You treat them like friends. You act like you like them. Because he did. He built relationships with them. Whether it was guys like Zacchaeus or sinful women or people that just, mobbed him because they didn't know what to do in this world. They were just like spiritual zeros. They didn't know anything about anything spiritually. Jesus was just with them. And you know what, friends? I want to encourage you in this. Build relationships with people who are spiritually disconnected. People that maybe haven't been to church in 15, 20 years. People that have never been to church. People that, maybe they are or are not Christians, but they're so disconnected from God, they don't know where they're going. To people who have no relationship with God. And we will always encourage you to be in relationship with other Christians, because that's good, that's important. But we should never make that exclusive. And we should always be looking for how God would send us on detours where we can build relationships, authentic relationships with people that are far from God. Because you know what? God uses those relationships time and time again to reach those people that he loves. He loves to use us to reach those people. And Jesus did it all the time. The other thing that Jesus did, we see this constantly. He just ministered to them. He cared about them. There's moments where he's healing them. There's moments where he learns how to just listen to them. One of the great miracles with the woman at the well was not that Jesus could, read, her mind on something. One of the great miracles there was that in a culture where Jews and Samaritans were completely separated, where men and women would not associate or talk, here is a Jewish rabbi that goes out of his way to just listen and talk to a Samaritan woman. And he was ministering to her just to listen and just to talk. And we can do things that just minister to people that are hurting in this world. And it's amazing how God can use this. You know, this past week, our high schoolers went down to Imaris, Mexico. And they did two things down there. They helped refurbish a hospital down there. They painted it, they cleaned it, they worked on it. And all they were doing is just ministering to people that probably don't know God. And they just poured I'm so proud of our high schoolers. They went down, they gave up their vacation to go down and serve in the name of Jesus. They ran a children's program for all of these kids, and they played games with them and told them stories and just gave them attention and just ministered to them. And God can use that. In fact, we've got this great I want to just show you this little video that just gives you a quick snapshot of our high schoolers simply doing ministry to people that are maybe far from God. Watch this video, then I'm gonna come back and share one more point.
Primero, todos tienen la pulsera. El primer nudo representa su nuevo nacimiento. La Biblia dice que Dios te ama y te ofrece una vida.
Isn't that great? That's our high schoolers. I love the little kid that's doing this. You know, stay on, and never mind. Yeah, won't go there. That'd be a bad moment. You know, and probably some of you are saying, you know, that was my high schooler. I've never seen him work like that, painting, cleaning. But you know what? They did that for the cause of Christ. And sometimes when there's a lost person, a spiritually disconnected person in your neighborhood or at work, and you love on them, you minister to them, you bring them a meal, you visit them in the hospital, you just help them out. You're fishing. You're fishing for men. The third thing that Jesus did that was so powerful was he just shared the gospel in the simplest of ways. He didn't make it this great, big, huge, complicated thing. Oftentimes, Jesus described the gospel in this overtly simple way. Believe. Just believe. Just embrace Jesus Christ. And you know, and I'm not saying that that's like all you say, but you can keep it simple. There are moments where you can just invite them. Say, you know what? Just come to my church. You might find it life-giving. You might find it as something that would help you begin to understand God more. Now, sometimes when it comes to sharing the gospel, we make it too complicated. Sometimes we make it into this thing where we feel like, you know, like someone asked me a spiritual question and like, I've got to like unload the whole thing. I got to walk them through the Roman road. I got to walk them through, you know, the Gospel of John. And I got to, you know, and I want to just caution you on that sometimes when someone asks you a spiritual question, that's not our opportunity to pounce, okay? And we can overtalk it. In fact, I want to give you an example of this. I'm going to ask Anna and Amanda to come out, and they're going to give us an example here in a moment of what not to do, because sometimes we get this moment where someone asks us a spiritual question, and we can feel like, I've got to unload my entire testimony of how I became a believer, and that's not necessarily the case. Watch this example here.
So, what's with all this church stuff? I am so thrilled you would even ask me because it's actually a fascinating story. See, I had this aunt and I just loved her. Loved her! Such a cool lady, but she would always drag me to church and I hated going to church, you know? But I liked her. I mean, she was a cheerleader in high school. I was a cheerleader. I don't know if you know this, but I went on a full ride scholarship to Northeastern State. Go Tigers! Anyway, before the whole college thing. My family moved to Tucson, hated the weather, loved the city. But that's where I met my husband. We were high school sweethearts, you know, kind of fell in love right off the bat. Well, actually, hilarious story. I first fell in love with his best friend. But I don't want to bore you with the details. Okay, well, maybe just a quick version. So there I am, on top of the cliff, yelling, "God, help me!" Can you believe they had to drain a pint of fluid from my right knee? And I turned to my husband right then and there and said, "We are never going bungee jumping in Mexico again." And that was the moment, you know, when God came into my life. And I knew my life would never be the same again. You know? Oh, wow. Oh, wow. Wow, I'm so sorry. I just was so excited. I just spit it out.
So, keep it simple, you know. You can say something, you can share part of your story. But remember, make it a safe place. If you go on and on, if you try and unload the whole truck on them and they want to back out a little bit, then you're not a safe place, and I promise you, they'll never want to talk to you about spiritual things again. But if you keep it light and easy, what you're saying is, you can talk to me about spiritual things anytime. They'll want to come back and talk to you more about spiritual things. They'll be willing to come to church with you sometime and begin to soak it in. Now, the other thing that sometimes we do when we're trying to share our story or share the gospel is, all of us, if you've been a follower of Christ for like more than a decade, you probably have what I call a weird Jesus story, okay? It's just like your deal. God did something that was really cool in your life, but to most everyone else, it's kind of weird, okay? I have my own little miracle with a VW bug one time, but I really don't tell that story very often because it's a weird but cool Jesus story. And sometimes we can be tempted to like share some cool story with us, but remember, a weird but cool Jesus story is a weird story to anyone else. And I'm going to ask Mark and Gabe to come out, and they're going to give us one example of this here, of what not to do with this, because sometimes we'll blow people away with something we think was cool and meaningful to us, but it's not where they were. So watch this example here.
So this whole God thing means a lot to you, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. You mind sharing that a little bit with me?
Absolutely. Are you ready to have your mind blown?
Sure.
June 22nd, 2003, summer solstice. I was just sitting down in my studio apartment eating breakfast after purchasing the latest Harry Potter novel. I was about to take my first bite when I looked down at the spoon, and I kind of noticed that one of the squares looked a little odd. And so I kind of turned my hand to get a better look, and all of a sudden this shaft of light came down from the window and illuminated one of the cinnamon swirls just right. And I swear I saw the face of Jesus Christ himself looking me square in the eye. Man, he had the hair, beard, the whole 9 yards. And to this day, I don't know what came over me, but I got on my knees, and I kind of felt this tingling in my hips. And I cried out to God. And I've been serving him ever since.
That is unbelievable.
You want to hear the really crazy part?
No.
Well, I got back in my seat, and I looked down at the bowl, and the milk had turned to wine.
Check, please.
So, if you see Jesus in your Cinnamon Toast Crunch, just keep it to yourself, okay? Just say, thank you, Jesus, and don't tell anyone else, okay? In short, there are going to be moments where God's going to send you on a detour. And it may be a moment that's confusing or difficult, but maybe, just maybe, below the surface of what's happening physically in your life, there's something spiritual going on. And maybe that spiritual something going on is that God is using you or the circumstances of your life to be someone who can fish for men, to be someone who can be a part of expanding this kingdom. And part of what we can do on a regular basis is just to be that person that's willing and looking to build simple, true, authentic relationships with people around us, whether they're Christians or not, and to be the kind of person that just ministers to people around us. And when God opens up those opportunities, it's to just share the basics of what it is to be a follower of Christ. And sometimes that starts with nothing more than just inviting them to come to church with you, to just experience it, for them to be able to kind of sort through it on their own without having anything crammed down their throat or having someone try and convince them or win an argument. Let God work in them and let God use you as a vehicle to just kind of bring them along on their own spiritual journey. And just watch what God does through you. Why don't you stand for a closing prayer here? And again, as we close out here, we're going to have do we have the 10-minute party? We do. We're going to have the 10-minute party. If you are new to Casas or visiting, I want to invite you to come back there. I'll be back there. Some of our pastors will be back there, and we would love to just meet you, greet you. And if you are a first-time guest at Casas, we have a gift for you. We have a book, a fantastic book called Prodigal God, and we would love to just give that to you, and you can just come right back there and get that book. Let me just pray for you. Father, I just pray that you would continue to take us on these intentional detours where you work in and through us for your kingdom, to allow us to experience what it is to be a part of your plan of redeeming this world. And we pray this in your Son's name. Amen. Have a wonderful morning, and we'll see you back here next week.